Hello, my name's Maria. I run Herstorical Tours. So Herstorical Tours is a theatrical walking tour company and what we do is we deliver walking tours, basically theatrical walking tours, unsurprisingly, where we bring to life women's stories in history, specifically women's stories, through acting, drama, comedy. So the idea is that, these characters from history are brought to life. It started when I created a witch tour, which I'm still running, and hence what I'm wearing right now. So this was born out of me being, very fascinated with the history of women's persecution as witches. And my own research into that, which I'd just done as a hobby. But also it was really, really kind of kickstarted by me being thrown out of a company I was working for. I was doing tours for this company, which shall not be named. And yeah, a lot of misogyny, a lot of bitterness and scapegoating going on. And I basically bore the brunt of that and was fired for absolutely no reason. I'm not going to go into that, but it was really, really upsetting. Like I felt like I'd finally found a job and a group of people that really, I felt accepted, and I felt like, oh my God, this is what I want to do. This is amazing. And unfortunately, yeah, it all kind of went a bit tits up. So I decided it was a little bit of revenge, but also I thought, they're not going to stop me. I'm going to create something myself. So I wanted to create something, and also as a bit of a fuck you, I wanted to create a really woman-centered thing, because this was a very male-dominated organization that I'd been in. So I created Hex and the City. So that's the name. It's a walking tour through the City of London and specific locations that are linked to the history of witch persecution, particularly London witches, obviously, and various locations linked with the occult in London's history. And I launched it last year in Halloween 2021, and it was incredibly successful, like much more successful than I ever expected. I only ran it for a week over the Halloween week, and sold out, and had to add extra tickets, and so I was really, really like amazingly surprised by that, because to be honest, I didn't think, it's the first time ever doing something like that. I didn't think it was going to do so well. And I got such a lot of really positive feedback about the subject, and realized that this is something that's really, really relevant now. It's very much aligned with what's going on in the world with Me Too, with a lot of the oppressed groups, coming up and really, really shouting and speaking and being pushed down further as a result of that. So it just seemed to attract a lot of these groups and these people that had been, particularly, queer groups, and other minority groups that were just like neurodivergent, that sort of thing, that was sort of like, we really relate to this history and we feel there's so much like parallels with what's going on now in many ways. So I just thought, wow, this is it. I feel like I'm doing really important work here. This is really, really good. And it's also something I love doing. So I basically got in touch with an occult bookshop called Treadwells. Well, actually, I didn't get in touch with them. They came along to the tour. They found it, and a couple of them came along and said they were from Treadwells. So then we started chatting, and Treadwells is a very famous occult bookshop in London. It's very, I'd say there's quite a few occult bookshops, but this one's very focused on women. It's run by a woman. I think it's probably the most queer positive, woman positive one from what I've seen, from the workshops that they offer and the events that they offer. So I thought this might be a good partnership. I could sort of set up in partnership. So basically we got together and through them, I run the tour throughout the year, once a month. So that's been going really well. And yeah, that really spurred me to create the second tour that I created in the summer, which was Harlots, Trumpets and Tarts, oh my, which was about the history of Georgian sex workers. And also very much linked in, the idea was it's always to link it in with what's happening now. So, and how the history has, you know, affected us today and continues to. So it's linked in with obviously sex workers today. And again, like the majority, I'm talking about women most of the time, because that's like obviously my speciality, but it's linked in with many other oppressed groups too, of course. So I ran that in the summer with a bigger cast, and that was quite an experiment because, you know, I was employing a cast and it was quite a big risk. I was expecting it to do as well as the Witch Tour, but it didn't, probably because of seasonal reasons, but also there was a lot more hinging on the fact I had to make a certain amount of money to pay my staff. So it was quite tricky. It was actually a bit of a struggle, but saying that, it went really, the feedback we did get was really, really good. So I'm not abandoning that. I'm hoping to bring it back, just when I've figured out the best way to market it and get it out to the right audiences. Yeah, so that's kind of where we are at the moment. And so for this October, this month, I'm running Hex and the City all during the month. When I say all during the month, just weekends, and over the Halloween period, so over that week. And it seems to be doing pretty well so far. I think we've sold about half the tickets so far. So yeah. So, I mean, the history of persecution, of the history of women being persecuted as witches, really, it's something that, I mean, as I always introduce this in the tour, that it links back to the church, because it does, you know, essentially. That's where it all began. And it also, it's interesting, there's a number of factors that kind of introduced the witch craze, if you like. It was across Europe. So not just here in England, of course, it was all across Europe. In fact, here in England, I say England because Scotland was a little bit different. We were actually, in terms of statistically putting women to death for witchcraft, much lower. And we had different ways of dealing with witches to the continent, which was a lot more horrendous. And I don't go into that so much, but on the tour, obviously, because I'm focused on London. But I'd say the witch craze was 1400 to 1800. It spans roughly a period of 400 years. And it's connected to the church in the fact that it was a way of quashing the old religions, the pre-Christian religions. And, you know, that came from the Vatican. That was started by the Pope in the 1400s. Various witchcraft acts were introduced over the periods of, over the years, over the centuries, and this depended on the monarch that was up on the throne, of course. Probably the worst one, or the most virulent anti-witch, misogynistic monarch, I mean they all were, but was James I, who was actually a Scottish king who came to the throne in 1604 here, or 1603, I think it's 1603. But he wrote a book about witchcraft. He believed that they were the scourge, women and witches were the scourge of the country. And he was also, if we're talking about the 1600s, that was probably the worst time to be a woman, because it also coincided with the English Civil War. And basically, women were scapegoated when things were going badly in society, whether there was a war, you know, so if we're talking about the Civil War, when a lot of people were suffering, if you know, the crops were failing in a village or something. And also what's very interesting is, so we're talking about social upheavals like the Reformation period as well, when it kind of, the numbers went up of women being persecuted as witches. But it was also to do with the printed press as well, because the printed press was introduced in the 1400s, and basically it became like a propaganda, so a lot of books were published. The most famous one, which is the second biggest seller next to the Bible, was a book called Malleus Maleficarium, and it was written by a German monk who was obviously a massive misogynist, and that very much influenced a lot of the books that came out of that period. Discovery of Witches, which was by a man called Sir Reginald Scott in the 1500s. Matthew Hopkins wrote a book, which was, I think, called A Discovery of Witchcraft. And he was the Witchfinder General that was running riot through the 1600s through East Anglia. So a lot of it was to do with propaganda, because the vast majority of the population couldn't read, but they would disseminate this information down from the upper classes, obviously, and it got passed into the villages. And this is why mostly it was in rural, poor villages that these witch persecutions took place, because it was a bit like Chinese whispers. The information got muddied of how you can spot a witch, or what she looked like, or what she was doing. And also these were the communities, very much like now, these oppressed poor communities that were really suffering. So they were looking for someone to blame. It's a bit like if you look at the way immigrants are blamed now for what's going wrong in these really oppressed communities. They'll blame them. They'll say, oh, it's these refugees coming in. And it was the same then, really. It was like, oh, it's that weird woman that lives on her own, that's not following gender norms. And that was another big issue, was women who were not following patriarchal gender norms. They were automatically regarded with suspicion. So if they weren't married, if they were widowed, it's like, oh, what did you do with your husband? Were you the cause of his death? If they were business women, because a lot of them were quite successful in their own right. I find it really interesting that all of the tropes that we link with witchcraft, so the pointy hat, the cats, black cats in particular, the cauldron, the broomstick, we link all those with witches now, don't we? But actually they were the tools of the trade for brew wives. So these were women that were in charge of brewing ale, because it was originally a woman's industry, and they would brew the beer. And so what they'd use is the cauldron to brew the beer. They would have the cat to chase away any rats, or several cats maybe. They would advertise on their cottage what they did with a broomstick, with a picture, an image of a broomstick. It's a way of advertising, I guess. And they would wear the pointy hats to distinguish themselves at market. So isn't it interesting that the narrative has been totally flipped? And now the beer industry, or the ale industry, is pretty much male dominated. And it's linked with men, but it was originally linked with women. So it's a way of it's just women who they regard as having power. Let's demonize them. Let's take that power away from them. Essentially, there's lots and lots of factors. I talk about all these in the tour. Lots of things happening all at once, really, but ultimately it's just about the fear of the patriarchy, isn't it? That these different people, these women, or anyone who's different, even women who dressed as, there was quite a lot of cross-dressing in the past, like there is now. This was seen as very, very, oh God, no, she must be bewitched, or she must be consorting with the devil. So lots of things to talk about. But in terms of how they were treated, so this is something I go into in more depth, but it really depends what period of history we're talking about, because different monarchs had different acts, witchcraft acts. Some of them, it was the death penalty if you were found guilty of witchcraft. But witchcraft causing pain or causing harm, which was called malefica, that was the sort of Latin term that you'd be charged with. So you could be put to death, depending on what act was out. If you were accused of being a witch at a time when there wasn't the death penalty, then you could be imprisoned. But what's really important to note is that it doesn't matter, even if you were found innocent, if you'd gone through the witch trial and that had been branded upon you, your village, your community is going to regard you with suspicion forever. And what happened with a lot of the time with these women is they were just literally cast out. They were cast out. They were left to, I mean, arguably that's not much better, because they were just left to die, really. You know, there's stories of women who were not executed by Matthew Hopkins during the witch craze in Essex, his rampage. But they were, you know, because there had been the finger of suspicion pointed at them, they were unable to buy food because no one would serve them. They were driven out of their homes, and they were made to go and live in the woods. And this is where we get the idea of the woman living in the woods, the witch living in the woods. It's because they were literally cast out and left to die, you know, left to fend for themselves. So it's just horrendous, really. And it just makes me think so much of how we treat immigrants, how we treat refugees. You know, nowadays it's really similar. It's frightening, actually. I mean, I'd probably consider myself to be a witch. I hesitate to say that because even now, I think it still has so many connotations and associations with it, that term. But I feel like it's being reclaimed, because ultimately, you know, which actually I'm going to tell you a really interesting acronym that I heard recently from a woman who runs a witchcraft organization in the States. Called Gabriella Herstick, I think her name is. And she's made an acronym out of the word witch. So it means woman in total control of herself, which I really, really like. I think that's really clever, because ultimately being a witch, I mean, what does it mean to me? I'd say it's just being who you are, and unashamedly, I think that's the right word, being who you are, and being kind to other people, to nature, to animals. That's ultimately what they were doing, these women. They were working with the old ways. They were just minding their own freaking business half the time. You know, they kept animals, they tended plants, they dealt with plant medicine, and they were persecuted for that because it was so threatening, you know. So yeah, I think if I judge that being the meaning of what a witch is, then I'd say I'm definitely a witch, and I'd say most people would also say they're a witch. I don't think it's limited to women either. Of course not. I mean, I think anyone, any gender, should be able to say they're a witch. Yeah, definitely. And also, I do love all the, you know, the nature. I like crystals. I like playing with things like tarot cards and manifesting. You know, if you want to talk about magic, isn't magic just making the life that you want? You know, just manifesting an intention. And we know, I mean, that's been proven to work. That does work. What you focus on expands, isn't it? So that is just basically magic. When you do a spell, you know, it's not conjuring up demons, is it? It's focusing on something that you want to happen. It's putting your focus on that, putting your intention on that. So I mean, I think there probably are people that might want to use this for negative ends, this kind of, and they do, of course, because it's about focusing on darkness and negativity rather than positive things. But if you intend only good for other people and good for yourself and good for nature, and be kind, be nice, let people live and let live. That's what I think anyway. So there were various different methods for persecuting women as witches. In terms of death penalty, in this country, what we tended to do was hang them rather than burn them. I think we often think of witches as being burned alive, and they were on the continent. They were, by and large, they were in Europe, they were burned alive at the stake. In Scotland, they were burned alive at the stake, but we didn't actually have that method of punishment for witches as such here, except when the charge was heresy. So heresy being a crime against the church. And then, you know, so this is where we get Protestant martyrs during the reign of Queen Mary I, the Catholic Queen. They were being put to death, and vice versa at various types in various periods in history. And the same would go for a woman who's been accused of a crime against the church, but also witchcraft is linked in with that. So there is one in particular I do talk about, a London witch, in the tour, where she had that punishment, but it was quite rare. But obviously before they were executed, and also even if the death penalty wasn't in, then they would be subject to a witch trial, which would include certain methods to determine whether or not they were a witch or not. And these would be pretty horrendous, really. I mean, it's torture, you know. Probably one of the lesser tortures or the lesser methods would be to make them recite the Lord's Prayer, word perfectly. Now that sounds quite simple, but when you consider a lot of the women, well, first of all, it was terrifying. You know, you would be imprisoned in a dungeon, essentially, in a prison, or, you know, and also another thing they would do is they would deprive them of sleep for days on end. So if you imagine you're someone who hasn't slept for days, probably hasn't eaten either, you'd be denied food and water and things like that. And you would be then forced to recite things from the Bible, recite passages. You're going to be a bit disoriented. You might stumble upon your words a little bit. You might even be nervous, and that would affect, you know, and a lot of these women were elderly, so they might have memory problems. So, you know, and it was up to the interrogator to decide whether or not you've passed. So he could just decide, and it is invariably he would just decide, oh, she's, you know, clearly not pronounced that word correctly, therefore she's a witch. So that was considered one of the lesser challenges, if you like. One that we've probably seen in the films was the pricking test. So this was where they would search for a mark, the mark of the beast on your body, a mark of Satan. This could be a mole, it could be anything actually. It could be a birthmark, it could be a spot, it could be a scar, a skin tag. They were often considered marks of the beast. And then what they would do is, particularly with moles and things, is they would lance them with like a sharp instrument. And if it bled, it was considered, you were considered to be innocent, because it was believed that the witch's mark didn't bleed. So what they would do with that, because you probably think, well, most of the time if somebody is pricked with a knife, they're going to bleed, and they do. And knowing this, what they did was they'd have a long piece of wood with a retractable knife in it, or a retractable pin that they could pull back. So if they wanted to find you guilty, they would pull that back so that you didn't bleed. However, if they wanted to find you innocent, there could be reasons why they might want to find someone innocent. For example, the interrogator wants to basically fuck the girl or something, or there's some other bribery going on, who knows, some sort of corruption. Then they would make you bleed. But nonetheless, you're being assaulted, aren't you? You're being tortured. There are cases of women being put on the rack, and this was often the case for heresy, because heresy was considered one of the absolute worst crimes you could commit, because it's a crime against God. Then you will be subject to the worst kinds of torture. So being broken, being stretched on the rack, there are cases of women being subjected to that. In different places, so over in the States, things were slightly different. During the Salem witch trials, there was evidence of people being pressed to death. This is where they'd literally be crushed, you know. It's just, yeah, it is horrendous. Another very, very common one was the ducking stool. So what they would do is, and this was apparently, but there's not clear evidence of this, but it originated in the 1640s, around the time of the English Civil War. And it was believed to perhaps originate with Matthew Hopkins, who was the Witchfinder General. The woman would be tied to a stool. She'd be bound. Sometimes her dress would be weighted down with stones in the pockets and rocks and things like that. What they would sometimes do as well is tie her right thumb to her left toe and vice versa. So she's sort of bound like that and can't move, essentially. And then they would slowly lower her down into a body of water like a river or a lake. If she sank to the bottom and drowned, then she was innocent. although she was dead. However, what you would do is, if you're going to be lowered into water and submerged, you're going to try and survive and keep your head above water. So if she attempted to do that, or even if she was treading water for a bit, they thought, okay, she's floating. And the rationale behind that is, if you float on the water, you're clearly a witch, because God's baptismal font has rejected you. So it was a sort of parallel with the baptism. And that what would happen then is you'd be dragged out, and often women were half dead by that point anyway. They'd be dragged out and hanged, because then it was considered, you know, they had to be hanged because they were witches. So this was often a mob thing, you know, it wasn't even an organized thing. The villages would literally drag out this woman and then take it upon themselves to drown her in a river. So it's interesting, because we don't have that many women recorded as actually executed as witches in this country, but there are probably tons and tons, and the same goes for Europe, of women, and not just women, individuals who were killed by villages, and it just wasn't recorded, you know. They've just disappeared. So it really is quite harrowing when you read a lot about this. It's just, if I think about the transgenerational trauma that we must all carry in us, and men and women, of course, we're all carrying this horror, you know. It's just, yeah, I don't even know where to start with it. That's why I feel it's so important to bring them to life and tell their stories, because this is horrendous, and there's still parts of the world where this is going on now. So we can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore. It literally is in the same form happening. I think one of the latest cases of a woman being put to death for witchcraft was in Ireland, believe it or not. And this was a woman who lived in a rural village, and she used to wear red a lot, which was considered, you know, scarlet woman. And her husband didn't like her going out. He thought she was cheating on him, which she wasn't. So he got together with her father and several other elder men from the community and set her on fire, just burned her alive. And the village gathered round, you know, and it's just, I mean, that was in the 1800s. So we're not talking about that long ago. We're talking about the Victorian era. So it's very rare, actually. In Ireland, there's not that many records of women being put to death for witchcraft, because the pagan was alive in Ireland. But yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if that's also because actually it did happen, but we don't have records of it, because it was happening in small villages, like this woman who was, you know, put to death by her husband, essentially. So I mean, yeah, so nowadays, obviously we don't persecute witches in this country or in this part of the world, but it is happening elsewhere, and it is happening, and women are still being oppressed elsewhere, and minorities are still being oppressed everywhere. So this is still very much alive and well. But I do feel, I feel like there's definitely a movement towards reclaiming reclaiming the title of witch or outsider, because the witch is the ultimate outsider, is the ultimate oppressed group. And I think that's why so many people are now, so many groups who were on the fringes are really identifying with this. I think this is why this is so important now more than ever. And it does feel like there is a movement towards reclaiming that, and just, you know, coming together to sort of heal that collectively. I think that is definitely happening. I can see that from the groups that are coming on the tours. So I'm getting a lot of interest from the queer community who really identify with the witch. And that makes sense because of the history of their oppression and their groups, and how the witch is so, you know, tied up with female sexuality in general, actually, and sort of, you know, a lot of the women that were persecuted as witches were considered overly sensual, you know, and indulging in deviant sexual practices, often with other women. And this was considered obviously a massive threat to, I mean, you can see it now, like how threatened men are now, a lot of cis het men at least, to women who are lesbians, and how they get, or they choose to be in a relationship with another woman, or a man chooses to be in a relationship with another man, and it's considered, you know, oh, massive threat to my ego. But I do feel like there is, you know, there's definitely a movement towards the old ways, like reconnecting with nature, reconnecting with astrology, with tarot, all these really ancient tools that we used to use, that communities used to come together, particularly women used to come together and share their knowledge, you know, plant medicine, natural medicines in general. I'm seeing this, you know, and places like Treadwells. I know I mentioned Treadwells, but there's tons of places that will are doing workshops that are bringing these like little tribes together, because I honestly think that you can call it the new earth, or the future, let's call it the future, is going to be about these little communities and these little tribes that are going to come together. You can see it happening now. We can see people being sort of brought together by the struggle against, well, Me Too, or Black Lives Matter, or, you know, the LGBT movements. And there are club nights I've seen now. There are club nights that are witch and occult themed, but also very LGBT inclusive, and they're encouraging people to just, you know, be themselves and be outrageous. You know, there's so many different things going on. Queer gardening collectives, and you know, getting to know, getting an understanding of plants in the way that a lot of, we've lost, you know, that they would have known back in the day. So I think it's definitely happening, definitely, without a doubt. And I think that healing is going on. It seems like it's not a lot of the time, because it seems like there's so many horrible things happening in the world, and the powers that be are constantly trying to quash us and bring us down, because I think they're aware that this is happening and they can't stop it. They can't stop it. So they are really, really doubling down. I mean, if you follow any astrology, I love astrology. So I follow quite a lot of astrologers who talk about how this is in the stars. This was going to happen anyway. Going a bit esoteric now, but this has been foretold, if you like, in the planets and the alignments for a very long time. So there's actually nothing that the governments, the institutions, they can do about this. They will try to cling on to power and control for as long as possible. We can see that, can't we, in what's happening in the world with our governments. But actually, this movement, this is happening. People are getting together, you know, people are you know, gender fluidity and when I say individualism, not in a Thatcherite sense, you know, being who you are and accepting who you are and accepting everyone else as well. And that is all that's happening. That's unstoppable. And I really think like it's almost like now is the time to heal all of this transgenerational shit that we've had for centuries and centuries and centuries of control and oppression. So yeah, I think how can I say it, really? I think we are being liberated, or we are not being liberated, we're liberating ourselves through all these different movements and telling, just storytelling, you know, telling these stories, because by telling the stories, this is how, because it's what we've tended to do is avoidance, isn't it? It's avoidance. It's just sort of pushing it away and shutting it away and forgetting about it, especially in this culture, in this society. You know, we don't really talk about stuff, and it feels like that's changing, that's slowly changing. Apparently the waiting list for therapists is, you know, ridiculous at the moment, higher than it's ever been, longer than it's ever been. So, you know, people are seeking to heal themselves, and you know, that is a start. That is a start, because honestly, I only a few years ago, I think if I'd mentioned, or if I'd heard anyone mention they were seeing a therapist, I think that generally the impression would be, oh God, what's wrong with them? Are they mad? Are they insane? You know, but it's becoming acceptable to heal and to heal yourself. And yeah, so I'm really positive about the future. I do think it's really going in the right direction, although sometimes it seems like it's not. Yeah, I think a big part of it is the psychedelic movement for sure. I think that it's all part of it. It's all a search for meaning, you know. It always, I mean, I suppose you could argue we've always been searching for meaning. In a way, it sort of probably started long before this, but in the 1960s with the whole hippie movement and the kind of reinterest in these kind of psychedelic experiences and, you know, that kind of thing. But I think it's really happening now properly, because I don't think the root of the trauma, of the collective trauma, was really looked at back then, but I think it is being looked at now. Yeah, and there are people experimenting with psychedelics, going off to see shamans in the jungle, and there seems to be quite a pull towards ancient civilizations a lot more now, I feel. There was an interest in this in the early part of the 20th century as well, with the kind of spiritualist movement, Aleister Crowley, etc. But I do feel like now is the time that a lot of healing, it just feels to me like it's definitely moving in the direction of collective healing a lot more, and the dismantling of these old ways of being, these old systems, these old institutions. I mean, they're breaking down around us, aren't they? And they're just completely crumbling, all of them, bit by bit, and yet they're still clinging on. But it's not the future. It just isn't. This old way of control and fear and top-down authority, it's just not the way, I don't think. And that's what people are realizing, and they're taking it upon themselves to go on spiritual missions, to meet other like-minded people and tribes, and you know, be that in the jungles in the Amazon, or perhaps, you know, I don't know, in a back garden in Croydon, you know. So but yeah, it's happening. It definitely is. Yeah, it's all part. I'd say that, yeah, I mean, if you look at it, the facts, the vast majority of women persecuted as witches all across the continent and here were lower class, poor women, a lot of them disabled, illiterate, mentally, mentally ill, or had a disability, had a mental illness, etc. Undoubtedly, the vast majority were, yes, exactly. And yeah, I mean, the lower we live in such a classist society anyway here in England. I think it's probably one of the most class-based societies in the world, isn't it? I mean, really. And that has continued. That's still going on now. I mean, bloody hell, you know, we're still, in fact, it seems to be, I don't want to focus on the negative, but with the current government, it seems to be getting worse in many ways, class-based inequalities. But yes, rich, wealthy women were persecuted as witches. You know, ultimately, it was a case of women being at the mercy of men. So, you know, you could have a noble woman, and I talk about this in the tour, all different types of women, you know, that were accused of witchcraft. Their class wasn't necessarily a safety net for them, you know, but ultimately, yes, of course. I mean, you're talking about what's the word? Extra levels of I don't know what the word is, oppression, because you've got gender, you've got class, and nationality, ethnicity in many cases. I don't have any specific, because I don't talk about the ethnicity issue so much in my work, but I know that in Salem, in America, where we had the Salem trials, one of the women that was sort of very much victimized, she was a Native American woman. And of course, because she was Native, she was considered to be dealing with all kinds of things. I've forgotten her name, Titty something. Titty, oh, I don't know. I'm not going to attempt. But yes, she was very much, because she had the obviously a poor Native woman. So we're talking about race, class, and gender, all linked in. So yeah, I mean, it's still an issue. It is still an issue. I mean, look how we demonize the working class. Look how, and if you're a person of color and working class, the opportunities are even more close to you, so it's always been a way of, and class is created by the wealthy and those in power anyway, the whole idea of class. So it's part of their control to keep the masses, in a perpetual state of lack, which is what they do. That's how they keep control over us. But I do think, I think we're rising up against that. I think we're, revolution is happening slowly, but it's happening. Yeah. See, my experience as a white woman is, and also the historical period I'm talking about, is focused predominantly on the white female experience, I suppose, if you like, because that's just the facts of the history period I'm talking about. But I'd really like to look at the queer element. I'd really like to look more at that, and cross-cultural elements as well. So obviously we live, and to be honest, we did live then in quite a mixed society, depending on what you're talking at, what period of history you're talking about. But certainly now, when we hear about witchcraft now, it's often in the case of people from, for example, from Africa, who believe in who do believe in, certain witchcraft practices, and also from the Caribbean, voodoo practices and various things like that. And we often hear of this in a very negative light, again, control, media, propaganda, that they are simply, killing, like murders that occur of children or whatever it is, due to belief in witchcraft. So that, I think, is really relevant, actually, because what they're doing there is demonizing and stigmatizing in the way they would have done in the past with propaganda, with, okay, predominantly white people in the past, but it's happening now because this is this savage race with their savage beliefs. But I think it would be really interesting to look at that, and to look at the roots of those beliefs and how it ties in with the historical context of witch persecution in this country, but also with what's happening now, and all of the beliefs and stigma and oppression that is happening now as well. And also looking at that and trying to frame it in a bit more of a positive light. Now, I don't want to do cultural appropriation here, so I would be looking to probably work with someone from that community. That would be quite good to do something like that. And also, I'm really interested in the queer community as well, and how it interlopes with that, because as we mentioned, sexuality is deviant sexuality, as it was deemed, was a very big part of the witch persecutions, the witch trials. And that there's a lot of history there as well. So I'd really, really like to go into that. And also how these two these two elements combine as well. I think that would be fascinating. So that's kind of something to look at. When I did my sex worker harlots tour, I wanted to look at the molly houses, for example, the history of molly houses. And because actually now a very big chunk of sex workers in London are trans, or don't identify as binary. So I think it would be interesting to go down that route and look at that as well, and how that ties in with how these people were viewed in the past. So yeah, that's that's something I'd really like to look into. I definitely need to do more research on. So yeah, so the witch, I mean, the witch trials and the whole idea of persecuting women as witches, persecuting people as witches, is based on control and maintaining control and seeing these actually as, strangely, symbol of power that needs to be stamped out, because the ultimate power and control has to be held by the authoritative, heteronormative, patriarchal systems, institutions, etc., and ways of being. But there's also the idea of creating the other, absolutely, because yeah, without the other, you don't have the group, do you? You need to create something you need that contrast, don't you? So it's about these women, these people being othered, and being created as, and that's how they're created, as scapegoats. So the idea of disunity, it's divide and conquer, isn't it? Of course it is. It's divide and conquer, dividing people in the ways that now we're divided along race lines, along class lines. The media, the government will constantly tell us that we're at threat, we're at risk from a certain group of people that are coming over on boats or whatever it is, the swarm of immigrants, that word was used, wasn't it? Like they're insects coming to invade, and this is pretty much identical to how witches or homosexuals or foreigners or whatever it was, people, women were viewed practicing the old ways, religious heretics, people practicing a different religion. It's insane the amount of blood that's been shed because of differences in belief, in faith, over an entity we can't see. It's just absolutely mind-boggling, isn't it? When you think about it, it's mind-boggling. So yeah, it's about creating this other in order to create unity in another group. And people want to belong, don't they? We all want to belong, we all want to feel part of something. That's why now we're going into tribes and things like that, but we always have done that. I mean, that's just human nature. So the ultimate way to keep control is say, well, you are part of this group. You can only be part of this group if this person is not part of this group, because this means that you're in the special group, you're in the special team. Yes, and you're right and you're good. And yeah, sorry, but yeah, I feel like I need to do that voice, because it's like telling a group of children that they're special, and this weird kid over here we don't want them in our group. It's like that, isn't it? It's like picking teams. It's just so exactly. So let's create the object of fear, the other. Let's create the other, and that is just a complete illusion. And people have been saying this for a long time. Like, nothing that I'm saying is obviously new in any way. A lot of people know this, but it's so ingrained in us, isn't it? It's so ingrained that it's really, really hard, and you find yourself actually othering people unconsciously a lot of the time. You really do. I mean, this whole, if I think of COVID and how it was created, the separation between, for example, those that were anti-vaccine, let's say, and those that were taking the vaccine, there was relationships breaking up over social media, friendships, families, all of this. But there was an otherness on both sides. There was this otherness of this group. In order for us to feel part of this group, we've got to other the other group. Yeah, absolutely, that's what it is. And I've heard there's also theories that they're created as like an object. There's an object for free-floating anxiety. So there's a theory that there is a free-floating anxiety in society, which is created by the powers that be, of course, and that needs to attach to something. So creating this object, this other, this group, this individual, once it's attached to that, that then gives you, you know, it's gone. It's that anxiety is not attached to you anymore. It's attached to that person, and therefore you are safe. So there's a whole psychological theory around that, which I sadly don't know enough about because I'm not that clever. But but yeah, it makes sense. I think it makes sense. We do it all the time. We're doing it on Twitter. It's happening on a daily basis. It's just like, you know, and social media has definitely made it worse, I think, because now that's it's, in many ways social media is bringing people together, but it's also you know, it's facilitating the revolution, but it's also being used as a vehicle of divide and conquer and control as well, you know. So yeah, there are downsides. So thank you so much for this interview. Really enjoyed it. And if anyone is interested in coming along and learning more about the history of witch persecution, particularly in London, Hex and the City is running throughout October. I believe the first date is the 16th, but you'd have to check that online. But if you go to my website, so it's www.herstoricaltours.co.uk. That's Herstorical, not historical. Yeah, herstoricaltours.co.uk, and then you'll find all the information on there. Or you can go to Instagram. The handle is at Herstorical_tours_. So all the information is on there, how to learn more about what I do and get tickets to a tour. It'll be lovely to see you there. Thank you.